Why is the cross, the emblem of shame, necessary for those who seek the crown? We consider a cross an emblem of shame, for innately we realize it is symbolic of opposition to God's law. As in the beginning, the misuse of power given unto us brought suffering in this material world. The cross is the emblem of shame to those who in the material world judge from appearance. It calls for humility, not stubbornness. It calls for suffering, not retorts. It calls for patience, not impetuosity. It calls for love of enemies, not hatred. It calls for forgiveness, not unforgiveness. All this must be borne in the cross that the crown may be laid upon the brow of the real heir, and not the usurper, who would never understand his or her subjects, nor the road to true development. Who else has cleared the way for humankind and said to all, "Whosoever shall do the will of my Father which is in heaven, the same is my brother, and sister, and mother." In bearing the cross we come to know the real meaning of the crown, the joy of completing a work, and the success that is the reward of a finished race. As we develop day by day, the idea of shame passes, and there comes the joy of being one with Him in the great work of redeeming humanity. It is, indeed, an emblem of opportunity, and we come to see more and more the face of the Master reflected in each cross we bear. The cross does not always remain the cross of shame. In the life of the Christ, the Holy One, the Son of God, it became glorified in having been overcome. Just so with us. Each cross met, bravely borne, and overcome, becomes radiant with light and brings us into a more perfect understanding of the purpose of life and the glory that may be in the crown of life. There was a cross that fell on me with shadows dark and long. It crowded out my sun, my light, and blotted out my song. But when I raised my eyes for help, I saw a radiant one that stooped to lift my heavy cross. 'Twas Christ, the blessed Son. Then, with these destructive forces, we find the first turning of the altar fires into that of sacrifice of those that were taken in the various ways, and human sacrifice began. With this also came the first egress of peoples to that of the Pyrenees first, of which later we find that peoples who enter into the black are the mixed peoples, in what later became the Egyptian dynasty. We also find that entering into Og, or those peoples that later became the beginning of the Inca, Erohim, that builded the walls across the mountains in this period, through those same usages of that as had been taken on by those peoples. And with the same, those that made for that in the other land, became first those of the mound dwellers, or peoples in that land. With the continued disregard of those that were keeping the pure race and the pure peoples, of those that were to bring all these laws as applicable to the sons of God, man brought in the destructive forces as used for the peoples that were to be the rule, that combined with those natural resources of the gases, of the electrical forces, made in nature and natural form, the first of the eruptions that awoke from the depth of the slow-cooling earth, and that portion now near what would be termed the Sargasso Sea, first went into the depths. With this there again came that egress of peoples that aided or attempted to assume control, yet carrying with them all those forms of Amilius that he gained through that as for signs, for seasons, for days, for years. Hence we find in those various portions of the world even in the present day, some form of that as was presented by those peoples in that great development in this, the Eden of the world. Be not overcome by much knowledge. Be not overdone nor undone by that as may be given. Remember, mine son, that thou saidst of him who did wage war. Even with him. Concerning the body of Moses, whom thou may even direct. That though he recognized his power, yet railed he not. But said, God will deal with thee. Not of thine own power may these forces be done. But flesh and blood may manifest a spiritual truth, but may not order a spirit in any direction. Aid and succor may come through flesh and blood, even to those near the pit. Yet there is fixed that impassable gulf, and he that makes his will one with the Father may be committed a care through his direction. Keep that as is given, my son, and err not in well-doing. For oft, as has been said, those that call upon the forces only in distress may be heard from afar. Keep thine self close, that those that would direct may be ever near thee. For the stumbling block always lies in self-aggrandizement of power and ability stored in one's own self, in the misuse of self in relation one to another. Keep the faith, my son. Keep the faith. Since the soul of each individual is part of the one soul, the great soul, or what Emerson calls the oversoul. Why then is it that its impulsions in each of us are not clearly and singularly heard? And what is meant by the phrase? A soul lesson. As if the soul, instead of being our guide and destiny, needed any lessons from the self, the incarnating entity? This, to perfectly understand, might require the whole period here of interpreting. But the entity forgets that God, the creative force, in creating souls, with the attributes of the oversoul, or the One, endowed each soul with free will in its movement through time and space. Being endowed then with a consciousness in whatever dimension of manifestation the soul moves in that period of expression. God, the first cause, has not willed that any soul should perish and has with every temptation given away a means of escape. The entity or soul, in any given period and time of manifestation in space, may use those attributes of that phase of its consciousness in whatever realm it moves, according to the dictates of that which impels it. Through its will. If the soul were at all periods, all manifestations, to keep in that perfect accord, or law, with the oversoul, or the first cause, or the soul from which it comes, then there would be only a continuous at-one-ment with the first cause. But when an entity, a soul, uses a period of manifestation in whatever realm of consciousness to its own indulgencies, then there is need for the lesson, or for the soul understanding or interpreting, or to become aware of the error of its way. What, then, was the first cause of this awareness? It was the eating, the partaking, of knowledge. Knowledge without wisdom. Or that as might bring pleasure, satisfaction, gratifying. Not of the soul, but of the phases of expression in that realm in which the manifestation was given. Thus in the three-dimensional phases of consciousness such manifestations become as pleasing to the eye, pleasant to the body appetites. Thus the interpretation of the experience, or of that first awareness of deviation from the divine law, is given in the form as of eating of the tree of knowledge. Who, what influence, caused this? Ye ask? It was that influence which had, or would, set itself in opposition to the soul's remaining, or the entity remaining, in that state of at-one-ment. What, then, is the first cause of man's expression? That he may know himself to be himself and yet one with the Father. Separate, yet as Father, Son and Holy Spirit are one, so the body, the mind, the soul of an entity, may also be at one with the first cause. In these experiences, from the lessons that were brought by word of mouth, the entity then, in the name Cleo, was the daughter of one that was sent later to fill those places, and coming with Felix and Agrippa into the land. This made for contacts that brought to the entity the understandings of how souls might gain a vision of the truths that make for life under any environ in the earth. Though the body may suffer, though the mind may be blanked, there is the remaining grace in the faith in him that gave himself as the ransom in the earth, despised of men yet without fault, showing forth his love in the manner of doing good among those that sought, and that were of the household of faith. In the one then before this we find in that period known as mythological, when there were wars among the Trojans. And the entity then among those that were in accord with those that would defeat the peoples gathered at the gate, and to Achilles did the entity report, and to him, many were the counsels given and taken. In the name Tishol. The entity gained and lost through this experience. Gained through the application of self as respecting the interests of others. Lost through aggrandizing the power to which the entity arose. For while suffering may bring understanding, causing to suffer to satisfy one's own self brings reproach. Hence in the present experience there is ever the urge by the entity, to others and for self. Be true to self in such a manner as to not bring reproach from others, and most of all from self. In the application of this may the entity 204 find a deeper thought. In that it is self's experience being latent, yet seeking expression and expansion in the present experience. In giving the interpretations here, these we choose. Minimizing the faults, magnifying the virtues. As the entity should in its experience and in its relationships with others. Being patient in all things, and yet this is the greater lesson to be attained or gained in the present. 4. The tendencies are for the entity to act at once and then think about whether it has been the right thing or not afterwards. It is best to be patient and quiet than to be sorry. 4. Remorse and regret causes a great deal of self-condemnation, and this no entity should do. While no entity should think more highly of itself than it ought to think, if there is the choosing first of the ideals of the life mentally and spiritually, the material will manifest in a much more satisfactory way and manner.